Hello and welcome to Digital Construction Conversations, brought to you by MBS. I'm your host, Paul Swaddle, and every episode I'll be talking to interesting people connected to the digital construction industry. Today I'm joined by an illustrious architect whose work I've learnt a great deal from and who partly inspired my own journey into architecture, Stephen Hodder MBE. We speak after the recent news from Manchester School of Architecture that he's taking on the role of professor there. Stephen is principal at Hodder Partners, a past president of the RIBA, was awarded an MBE for services to architecture in 1998, and is coming to the end of his term as chair of the Construction Industry Council. The book Contexts, which in 5 overlapping essays provides a retrospective of Stephen's work and the history of the practice since the early 1990s, finding the story of the practice's development to be really thought-provoking, their ability to work successfully at different scales and typologies, moving from multiple inner-city regenerations and their part in the resurgence of Manchester into a global city, the Stirling Prize-winning Centenary building in Salford, to the delicate, peaceful evolution of St Catherine's College, Oxford, working in the shadow of Arnie Jacobsen. I was also keen to understand how much Stephen represents a certain type of construction professional, watching the implementation of digital construction from a place of leadership and seniority, and overseeing the work of teams well-versed in various new technologies, but with much to teach them in terms of design, detailing, practice management, and his depth of project experience. Here's a wonderful conversation with Stephen Hodder. As we chat, it's been announced that you're joining Manchester School of Architecture as Professor of Architecture there, and you describe profession, education, and practice as a triangle, all sides of which are important to you. So is that important in terms of contributing and teaching architecture as much as practicing it?
You're right in that I've always had that belief that the triangle of practice, profession and education is important. It's important for, I believe, practitioners to contribute to education of future architects, but I also have a very strong belief that education continues into practice. Yeah. Even now, having been in practice over 30 years, every day is a new learning experience. And so I think that dialogue between education and practice is hugely important. And then, of course, I think post-Grenfell and the Scottish schools problems, the RIBA will have produced a document called The Way Ahead, which is bringing about changes to the validation in which climate literacy, life safety, and in other words, practice-related matters will become an important part of the validation process. So it becomes even the imperative of practice contributing to education and to schools of architecture becomes even more important, I think.
That's fantastic. And you've mentioned The Way Ahead, the RIBA report, and your ideas around reforming education were really important when you were president of the RIBA. And those ideas included quite a vast rethink of architectural study, but the traditional path to becoming an architect sort of still prevails. So what still needs to change from your perspective?
Well, you're right, Paul, in that the architectural education went through a major transition in the late 1950s with the Oxford Conference, which was chaired by my external examiner, actually, in the early 80s, Sir Leslie Martin. Yeah. And really, the pattern of education in schools of architecture really hadn't changed a great deal in the period up to the education review that you're right that the RIBA was undertaking when I was president, largely led by the Director of Education, David Gloucester. I think we'd seen and continue to see the cost of the cost of education, university education, increasing, but particularly the case in architecture. I think there was also the notion that a part 3 was something that when bolted on at the end was very much outmoded. So the motivation of the review was to improve accessibility and to look at a more integrated approach to architectural education. And I, when the office-based examination, which is now called the RIBA Studio, I was its external examiner when it transitioned from Portland Place to Oxford Brookes. And indeed, even before that, I had tutored a very tenacious young architect, who is now an architect, for 10 years, who had gone through that same process. And really, the importance of it to me was that it improved accessibility to the profession, and that too, as part of the education review, that was another motive in the review to make architectural education far more inclusive and far more accessible.
Absolutely. And I guess widening access to the profession, have you seen a distinct difference in, I suppose, Salford and other places that you've taught? Do you think the path to architecture is becoming more inclusive?
Yes, but it's not happening quickly enough. My experience, certainly as visiting professor at Salford over the last 4 years, yes, I have seen developments in that way, but more needs to be done. And again, I think that's a very integral part of the Manchester Schools of Architecture vision for the future.
When I think of you and Hodder and Partners and its previous incarnations, I think of Manchester, and along with Ian Simpson and BDP and Urban Splash, you're synonymous with the resurgence of the place and with the culture of the city. How have you seen Manchester change as you've been practicing?
Beyond imagination, hugely. When I came to Manchester in the mid 1970s, there was a single theatre, one theatre in the city. People, worked in the city, but then left at the end of the day. There was one residential development, St John's Gardens, in the city. So hardly anybody lived in the city. All the redundant cotton warehouses and so on were occupied on the ground floor, but then all the upper floors were just completely derelict, full of pigeons. So I think after the city has always had this wonderful can-do attitude, and I think in 1996, Sir Howard Bernstein and Sir Richard Leese came together and led the city for 20 years. And that on the back of regeneration, maybe spurred on by the terrorist attack in 1996. Although I think this regeneration had already started, but nevertheless it was accelerated after that. Richard Rogers towards an urban renaissance, that too reinforced this rethinking of the cities. And there is no doubt that with that leadership, people return back to the city, and the core now is almost barely recognisable. And the amazing thing, that development continues. There's a real momentum, and I think I've been very fortunate, very lucky to the development of Hodder and Partners. It's been being in the right place at the right time.
Indeed.
If we've contributed to that in some way, then that's wonderful. But I think we've just been carried along with, as I say, the remarkable regeneration that we've seen in the city, in the last 30 years.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the attack in 1996, and one of the most recognisable interventions that you've made to Manchester is the Corporation Street footbridge. For listeners who may not be familiar with that project, can you talk about how that came to be?
Yeah, it's a story in itself. It's quite. It's. I remember saying at the time that well, it got to a point where having it was a competition. It was a limited competition, and it was a competition to replace the footbridge beneath which the bomb was detonated. Thankfully, there were no fatalities, but there were many injuries, and of course, it ripped the core out of the city centre.
Huge amount of retail damage and everything. Yeah.
The previous bridge, which connected the old Marks and Spencer to the Arndale Centre, was quite a visual intrusion within the street, and yet Corporation Street, has this beautiful curve as one looks south in towards Albert Square. So I was very keen that the replacement bridge would be a much more transparent, a gentler intervention within the street, but one that would signal the regeneration of the core after the attack. The design process started out as just a very simple, transparent tube, but we were working with Arabs and Arab facades in particular, and we couldn't have delivered the bridge without them. And by simply twisting that tube, it gave it a rigidity. And then, sometimes things almost happen by serendipity. We realised that it could be constructed from straight lines and facets. And then the idea of it being almost a sort of piece of public art and intervention within the street, something which symbolically stretched across the street. The imagery became very powerful for us. And as I said, we were very fortunate to win the competition. And then, of course, we were set about the challenge of delivering this because as a technology, it had never been done before.
Exactly, yeah.
There were towers that have used that same structural principle. But the bridge, it couldn't impose any tension on the edge beam of the Arndale Centre. And equally, it was supported between two columns on the new Marks and Spencers, and columns that were not even there at the time of the design. And in fact, once we started on site, we discovered that the openings, even though there was the same contractor either side of the street, the openings, there was a 4-degree shift in the openings, and yet here was a piece of pure geometry. The bridge, the hyperbolic paraboloid, the form that it takes, at its centre had to be 5.6 meters above street level in order to get, buses through.
Of course.
At its narrowest point in the centre, it couldn't be any lower than 2.1 meters high because of building regulations. There was a deed in place between the respective owners of the shopping centres either side of the street that said it could never be narrower than 2.7 meters. And it was the first time that we modelled It was the first time that we modelled a piece of architecture in 3 dimensions, because it was the only way in which we could meet all those constraints. And I have to say that then I went to Manchester Millennium because at the time, trying to manage all of that was almost seemed to be insurmountable. And I remember meeting Manchester Millennium and saying, Alison Nimmo, now Dame Alison Nimmo, who became Chief Executive of the Crown Estate, she was Sir Howard's number 2 then. And I remember saying to her, can you just give me 24 hours to try and resolve all of these problems? And we did. But even then, the glass technology had never been used before. We were very keen that it should be almost in defiance of the attack, that the bridge should be highly glazed and transparent. But the glass technology had never been used, and so we had to test it at Northumbria University.
Amazing.
It was an incredible project for us. We'd never delivered anything like that before. And the way it was received, it did become this. I remember it being lowered in place, and when it was opened, and rather anecdotally, when the ribbon was cut, I think it was right at the end of 2000. There seemed to be about 100 people on Marks and Spencer's and 100 people in the Arndale Centre, all waiting for the ribbon to cut, and then they all charged to the centre of the bridge at its narrowest point. And I was standing alongside a structural engineer, and I said to him, "Did you ever envisage that the bridge could take 200 people who they simply couldn't pass it?" But no, it cemented our relationship with the city leaders, and it was something that we're terribly proud of. It was a very small contribution to the regeneration at that time, but one that we're very proud of.
Yeah, and became a real landmark, and certainly an inspiration to me and many others, I'm sure. One of the things that you mentioned there is obviously working with Arup, and perhaps at Colne Swimming Pool as well. Your practice seems to have a very close relationship with engineering. And so do you kind of consider yourself to work particularly well with engineers and to collaborate particularly well? Has that been something?
It's not just engineers, Paul. When I left School of Architecture for 2 very brief years, I was at Building Design Partnership. And Sir George Grenville Baines had just retired, and indeed in the early days of the practice, he was a great sage and a great supporter of the practice, and I got to know him very, very well. But that whole process of multidisciplinary working and collaboration and integration is something that I think has always been a foundation of the work that we do in practice. And whenever if you to look at key moments in the practice development, key buildings, so many people have contributed to those buildings. Not only architects who have worked with me, but also the teams, and that includes delivery teams. The Centenary building, the inaugural Sterling Prize. AMEC Design and Management contributed hugely to that, and then more recently the what's called the Welcome Building, but essentially the visitor centre at the Royal Horticultural Society's Fifth National Garden. Again, engineers, contractors, specialist subcontractors, the roof structure, architecture. This is something that I like to bring to education. That again, the education model, sometimes it's easy for a student to think that you're alone in designing, but in fact, designing buildings is not a solo practice. It requires collaboration and input of so many people, and I think that's been essential to the work of the practice.
I find that really fascinating about some of your early work, where especially Centenary building and the swimming pool work, for you and Michael Lees as a young practice, the scale and the amount of work that would have been required must have been huge. And am I right in hearing that Centenary building was designed in 11 weeks? Yeah,
it was. We had won a competition for what was then University College, Salford. We won a competition to convert their former Department of Art and Design to the business school, and that had worked very well. And then University College secured a grant from the European Regional Development Fund. But the condition was, that was September, the condition was that the grant had to be accessed before Christmas. And so, yes, we embarked upon a very, very swift design process, getting planning consent, and clearly we proposed to the client that they then procure by way of a management contract, because there was no way that we could possibly design and detail a building so quickly. So yes, the contract was signed on Christmas Eve, and then by now, AMEC Design and Management became a part of the team, and we detailed it alongside with them, starting on site the following April. So, and then to compound all of that, University College, in the early stages of the project, merged with the university. Centenary Building started its life as a faculty of electrical engineering.
Fascinating.
And we were up to first floor when the director of estates called me and said, "Look, we've now merged with the university, and they already have a department of electrical engineering." So internally, we've decided. It was quite ironic that we started. We converted a former Department of Art and Design to the business school, but then Art and Design relocated to the Centenary Building, and what were initially designed as laboratories became studios. There were 3 lecture theatres. One of them was retained; the other 2 became graphic studios. So even during the course of construction, the brief changed hugely.
It's extraordinary.
It had this sense of industry, and in a way, there was a lovely meeting between the end user and the building's design. But thankfully, the flexible systems that we designed in there were able to deal with a complete change of brief.
Incredible.
Yeah,
to have resolved something so successful, and for listeners who may not know, obviously it won the inaugural Sterling Prize, awarded that year. Along with Colne Swimming Pool, you had enormous success really quite young in your career. What did that mean to you? Did that bring added pressure, or did it bring new opportunities?
Both. Yes, I think it did bring pressure in the sense in unexpected ways, because between Colne Swimming Pool in '92, winning the competition to extend Arne Jacobsen's masterpiece at St. Catherine's College, and then the Centenary Building, that we saw tremendous growth in the practice. We suddenly were on shortlists for the city centre of Coventry, up against the likes of Sir Richard McCormack and the Jubilee campus that Hopkins Architects won. So suddenly we were thrust into competitions like that when I don't think we were terribly prepared for them. But equally, we were a young team, and young architects would join the practice, and there was almost a huge expectation, both externally and internally. But it was a remarkable few years.
I'm sure.
And I'd like to think set a pattern, and that hopefully we've really been able to sustain, ever since.
In context, the book that provides a retrospective of the work of your practice, one thing that stands out is your drawing and these beautiful pencil on paper, tracing paper sketches and axonometrics, especially as you mentioned of St. Catherine's College, Oxford, which we'll come on to. The book even describes your work as almost being in pursuit of art. So how important is drawing to you and to the practice of the architect?
Immeasurable importance. I still have the one drawing board. It's not used as intensively as it used to be. But obviously, we've seen such a huge change in the profession, and a huge change in procurement, and a huge change in the industry. I worry sometimes that the immediacy of the sketch is lost. I try and instill it, and when I am teaching, how important the sketch is, not just in terms of communicating to clients, but in the interrogation of a design problem. and I always say I just love and enjoy seeing the struggle of a sketchbook. So sketching and drawing is immeasurably important to me, both as a design process, as a tool in the design process. But of course, today we have so many more tools available to supplement
Absolutely.
that. But I think that our work, my work, always starts off with the sketch.
And I imagine that you share a perspective with many of our listeners and MBS customers who I encounter, often who are practice leaders or directors, very high up in the industry, who have been in practice during the transition from almost completely hand-drawn methods into, a world of digital tools, and that those tools provide greater efficiency, and that it wouldn't be possible to produce the kind of projects that you do without those technologies. So how do you, as a leader of the practice and, as a person very much, as you say, still ingrained in the design process, embed technology and ensure that it's used to support and make buildings more efficient than affect the design process?
I rely enormously on the teams here. I never retrained, in part because my role was very much about design leadership and business development, and so I never had the opportunity to retrain. In a sense, when we moved to, and it was around about 1996 when we first bought our first CAD machine. That in a way was just a replacement of the drawing board, but just a medium. Obviously, more of late with building information modelling, that's been an even greater leap. So I'm dependent enormously on the teams in the practice. A young architect who recently was promoted to, so he joined us from Foster's. He's brought a tremendous knowledge of BIM with him. I think it's been quite interesting to see that transfer of knowledge that he's gained in other practices and brought them here. In a way, it's underpinned that notion of integration, that notion of collaboration. The technology that we now have has enabled it in a way that certainly a bit of a vision when I started out in practice. But I am hugely reliant on the teams and directors making proposals to me as to how we develop as a practice in that regard.
One of the chief criticisms maybe made of a kind of technology-first approach is to undermine the teaching or the skills of fabrication and buildability and junction details, whereas it's clearly not the case with your projects, which retain a kind of craft and materiality very legibly. How do you maintain and kind of oversee the quality of the outputs that are coming out of the practice?
Well, I think that the making of building and the crafting of building was embedded from day one, and that's back to the education and the University School of Architecture. So I'm bearing in mind that I'd only been qualified a single year when I set out in practice. I knew no other way. We from day one, we've always had that foundation about the making of buildings and the importance of detail. And I'm pleased to say that the commentary on the work of the practice has always said that. As you grow, it becomes then to make sure that approach is then embedded consistently is challenging. I'm still very much involved, whilst I don't get involved in working drawing programs really anymore. I'm still involved in every project in varying degrees. So I'm always there to be able to advise and just looking in a sensible way in which we bring buildings together. But I think that as the technologies, in terms of how we interrogate design, but also the technology within the industry generally, as they've developed, we come to rely more and more on specialist knowledge So again, if you take the roof of the RHS Welcome building, RHS Garden Bridgewater, we knew the vision. We had the ambition as to what we wanted. I think we had a view about scale and size of members. But then it took Hess in Germany to then respond to our performance details and to make it happen. And they contributed hugely to the connections and added so much. But we set out at the beginning exactly the vision for the crafting of that building. And I think you see that in I wish in many ways that specialist design could be introduced far earlier. Sometimes the procurement systems don't allow it, but in many ways, to have recourse to specialist knowledge, curtain warning, it's become so sophisticated now.
Of course,
it's one thing that I, if I could try and if there was a transformational change, is to be able to access specialist knowledge and specialist design much earlier in the design process.
It's really interesting. I think you've talked about a kind of overseeing process there, and everything that I've read about your practice indicates that it's a place of design studio culture and a place of architectural conversation. How has the pandemic affected the last year in terms of being able to move that process digitally?
I think for the teams that work so closely together and rely on direct interfaces, the sketch, at the outset, it was quite challenging. There was a degree of novelty almost, but for someone like myself who leads the practice, that sort of transition to remote working was difficult. But I think we all had to learn new skills very, very quickly. A lot of our projects were put on hold. The other aspect of the challenges that the pandemic brought, almost overnight, the practice, we halved the size of the practice almost overnight to match the projects to resource. Whilst clients were getting used to this new way of working, but also thinking about the uncertainty. Decision making seemed to take so much longer as our clients and local authority, not so much local authorities, but our clients were furloughing people, contractors with, obviously, we had 3 projects on site at the time, and it was amazing that they managed to keep going, albeit operating at about 60% efficiency. Commercially, it was. Thankfully, we'd had and as you know, my wife is the managing director of the practice. And while she's very much a working architect, she runs the practice, and with financial prudence, we. In a way that we'd never had before, because this is the third recession that I personally had to work through. And so quite different than the previous 2 recessions. We had significant reserves that we could call upon. So in that sense, we were always, we were quite robust, but it was difficult. It was, maintaining the momentums on site. By the time it came to the 3rd lockdown, which obviously we'd just come through, there's been a growth in opportunities, I'm pleased to say. I still think there's a great deal of uncertainty of we're not seeing, whereas historically we would secure a planning consent and then move straightforwardly into delivery phase. I think many of our clients, and we're talking about some significantly, some of the projects we're working on currently are significant projects. Clients are then are just pausing and just waiting to see, what happens. We don't have a single project on site at the moment.
I see.
But equally, there are so many opportunities that are being introduced in practice.
Things in the pipeline, as it were.
And of course, one of the benefits, I suppose, in learning these new ways is that for almost 2 years now, I've been chair of the Construction Industry Council, and that's made me. I've been able to access meetings more. Or equally, I've been more accessible. So that it's had its. There have been the new ways of working has enabled. Certainly, in terms of my work at the CIC. That work has been far more attainable than it would have been ordinarily.
One thing you noted there is that Claire, your wife, has been managing director and a co-collaborator for many years and is an exemplar of women in senior roles in the construction industry. And the book describes Claire overseeing large projects in order that, in a way, you can focus on design leadership and things like your work with CIC. What is it that's made that partnership work so well?
What an interesting question. Claire had been working for a very large international practice and was I think she was an associate director there, but was fairly senior in that practice. And when our first boy came along, which was nearly 17 years ago now, we knew that because the respective practices were so different, we knew that we wouldn't be in competition with one another. But equally, through my experience of trying to lead the practice in design and business development, but also managing the practice, for a number of years we had a London office. I felt that I needed someone desperately to. I think I'm somebody who has a good deal of self-recognition. I know things that I'm good at and things that I'm not so good at, and I think that it was a speculative venture at the beginning because I thought that the skills set that she has would supplement our own and my own. And of course, there are a whole number of practices that one can think of where the leadership of those practices has been about that complementarity of skills. Inevitably, when we said, well, let's give it a go and see what I don't think anybody could have predicted how well it's worked out. And I think when I became president of the RIBA, and most weeks I was there 4 days a week, and so there was an acceleration in Claire's development because she was, then very much coming to the fore and running the practice. And then when I concluded my term, that role was cemented, and the growth of the practice and development of practice is so much down to her because of what of the skills that she brings, and I think also the fact that when you actually look at the mix of it's quite interesting when architects join the practice and they see Claire at the helm of the practice.
Absolutely.
How that we've got a real sort of a really good mix in the practice now, and I think it's
wonderful.
Again, a great deal down to her leadership.
It would be a failure on my part not to speak with you about Arne Jacobsen and, of course, your sensitive work at St Catherine's College, Oxford, decades-long work extending and complementing the Grade 1 listed college buildings here. And your work is always described as responsive to what existed before, and yet exceptionally modern and an interesting take on what was existing. How much time, in terms of your initial process, do you need to spend somewhere like Jacobson's buildings and at Oxford exploring the context to be able to achieve that kind of a resolution?
Context in all its aspects, the context in which we work, the context of a site, the context of a place, has always been a very strong generator in the work of the practice. St Catherine's was such a powerful context, but also the context of Jacobson's approach to architecture was equally powerful. When I was in fifth year at the School of Architecture, former president of the RIBA, Rod Hackney, he concluded a full-volume PhD thesis on the work of Arne Jacobson because I'm not sure that it's commonly known, but Rod Hackney worked for Jacobson for 2 years. And when Jacobson died in 1971, Rod Hackney accessed the archive on which his thesis was based. I was wrestling with a design project, and my tutor said, "Oh, you should go and have a look at this thesis, which is in the library." And that was the introduction to the work of Jacobson, and never thinking that 13 years later, we would win the competition to extend, what I think is his masterpiece. Obviously, that period in fifth year prompted me to go and visit the buildings, and what I saw was this incredible fusion of Nordic classicism with a group of buildings that were very much of the collegiate tradition in Oxford. The way in which the buildings were arranged around the quadrangle and engendered a sense of community. The way in which the rooms were arranged around a staircase as an organisational device rather than along corridors. So, winning the competition in '92, you almost couldn't have a greater source of reference material alongside you. And I learned so much from just looking at those buildings and understanding the way in which they were made, the way in which they did create the place, the way in which they did, as I said earlier, engender a real sense of community. We'd never, when the first phase, I'd never designed a concrete building before. So there was a real sort of organic growth of knowledge because of the buildings that we were alongside. But of course, through that as well, it introduced me to dissing and vitling, which was the surviving practice. And architects that had worked on the project, a wonderful architect, Peter Denny, who was an associate for Arne Jacobson, also worked with Colin St. Wilson on the British Library. So the buildings were not just a source of knowledge. There were people who were around. Knud Holscher, more famously known for designing the D-line ironmongery. It brought me in touch with the Jacobson Foundation. Tobias Jacobson, Jacobson's grandson, is a friend now. And, again, it's not just the buildings, but the intellectual thinking behind those buildings has always been accessible. So that's been 20 years of, obviously our work is concluded, the practice work is concluded there now, but it was 20 years of a wonderful client as well, a challenging client who aware of the the heritage behind the college, their expectations were incredibly high. The demands on quality were incredibly high.
Yeah, one of the reasons that's often cited for the success of that project is that long-termism and the relationship that you have with the client. Almost in order that you can maintain a close control over the finished product. But that procurement route, as you mentioned already, tends to exist a lot less now. Is that still the ideal situation of the relationship?
I mean, the first phase was, and some of the minor work there was a traditional procurement. The second phase, which in many ways is quieter, but I think the detailing is better. I think that's in part because as a practice, we had developed a knowledge. But I almost think that there's no better example of post-occupancy evaluation, because when the second phase came along 10 years after the first phase, the college had been living with our a young architect's work, and they were able to give me incredible feedback that we were able to build on, and when we delivered the second phase. And again, I worked with, particularly on the second phase, I worked with some wonderful architects within the practice to enable what we did there. But there's no doubt that the sort of coming together of the powerful context, a client expectation, the constant feedback, was all things that came together to deliver ultimately what we delivered there. And it's been a spine of work throughout the practice.
Absolutely,
and has gone on to inform so many other projects.
And one of your key outputs as president of the RIBA was the publication Client and Architect, subtitled "Developing the Essential Relationship," and that indicated recognition of that change in the roles of the architect and also the relationship between clients and architects. Compared to something like a property development that you've been involved in, where the architect might be novated across, how do you approach those projects differently? Is that something that changes the design process for you?
As I said earlier, we've seen a huge development in the profession and the industry since I joined it in the early 1980s. But I think that, and certainly I feel that some of the early work that we did within, under a design and build contract, I sensed that not only as a practice were we learning that process, but equally there were contractors that were equally learning the process as well. So we've seen an enormous development there. I clearly understand the desire to minimise risk, contain costs and programme, by procurement by that means. But in a way, the way that we work alongside the delivery teams, I think as it's developed as a process, for me, it's almost indistinguishable from the way we work with the traditional procurement. We're still as intensively engaged. Yes, we don't deal with contract administration, but in terms of the expectations on us as a practice in terms of detailing, in terms of inspections, as a procurement process has developed, I don't think it's almost imperceptible. And in fact, referencing the St. Catherine's work, I think many people, the second phase was procured by way of design and build. I think that many people would look at that and actually say that it's better than the first phase that was delivered by traditional means. Now, that's not always the case, and I do recognise that for every good example of design and build procurement, there are design teams and architects who could demonstrate poor examples. But I think it's recognising the shifts in the industry, that to deliver a building is a very, very complex process, and successful delivery is about working together and collaborating together. And when that collaboration doesn't happen, and when there isn't that mutual respect, that's when you have those problems. But conversely, when there is that mutual respect, that willing to engage in discussion and collaborate, that's when you deliver, really, really good architecture. Remains to be seen what people think about the Welcome Building at the RHS, because it opens next month. But that has been for this practice in recent times, one of the most wonderful pieces of collaboration.
Fantastic.
And again, as I said, it remains to be seen what the quality when people, when the building's accessible and people see it. But that was in the delivery of that, and the quality that's been achieved there. We were novated to BAM, but I can't speak highly enough of BAM. They've been absolutely wonderful to work with.
That's brilliant to hear. Something else that you seem to share with Jacobsen is almost a design detail ability. I'm thinking of St. Clair's and even Cube Gallery and places where at every scale within the building, there's an exceptional level of design and aesthetic taken into consideration. Jacobsen is as famous as a designer of furniture, and even, he was going into cutlery and glassware and hotel keys and all kinds of things. You're a purveyor of fine details. Have you ever wanted to expand into other areas of design beyond architecture?
Oh yeah, I would have loved to. The opportunity has never really availed itself. I mean, we do. I was approached once to design a range of ironmongery, but again, as I said, I'd like to think I'm very self-aware, but the Holscher's D-line ironmongery, I concluded that it was almost impossible to better that. So why try?
Why try?
If you have something as beautiful and as perfect as that, then why try? But not in all our buildings, but in a lot of our buildings, we have been able, particularly with fixed pieces. So the RHS building, we have been engaged to design all the fittings within that building. Things like the retail desk and at St. Clair's, a lot of the fixed furniture, again within bedrooms and so on, were very bespoke. We did design the first phase of St. Catherine's. We designed the desk. So they always tend to be on the back of a project.
Yes.
But not. I've never. I sometimes never have the time, or never been approached to extend my thinking into furniture design or.
Sure.
Yeah.
One question, which I guess relates towards that, is projects like the National Wildflower Centre at Knowlesley or Grange over Sands Berners Pool, which, for the benefit of listeners, one is sadly derelict and the other which was demolished, because after a certain point, you have no control over what clients or trusts choose to do or unable to do with their buildings. How do you reconcile those projects in the history of the practice and in your mind?
They're two sad projects in many ways, and for different reasons. Both the inception of both projects were spearheaded by some wonderful individuals. Grant Luscombe, who was the chief executive of Landlife, who commissioned the National Wildflower Centre, was a remarkable man and is a remarkable man and was a remarkable client. I think in that instance, he retired sometimes it tends to happen when you then have a second generation of people who maybe either don't understand the spirit of the organisation. I mean, I think in the case of Grange over Sands, again, it was a wonderful group of local residents who got together because school children were having to be bused to Barrow to swim, and I think it was the Sports Council, but what became Sport England, recognised that area of South Lakeland that needed some sort of swimming facility. The local authority were not going to provide it, and so the wonderful group of individuals got together. But then they moved on. The trust was handed over. Swimming pools are notoriously very, very difficult to. The financial models are very challenging.
Of course,
they were not supported at all by any funding from the local authority, and so I think probably what was common to both projects was funding was withdrawn, and tragically, in both instances, the organisations decided to close. So, and in fact, in both instances, we tried to, well, in the case of Grange over Sands, Grange over Sands swimming pool, had meetings with the local authority to understand what we could do to support, because they tendered the management, but no one seemed to really come forward. But we tried to support the local authority. And equally in the case of the National Wildlife Centre, even actually during lockdown, the first lockdown, I was approached by an organisation who wanted to, regenerate that building.
Amazing!
But it didn't seem to come to anything because it's a very, very bespoke building. It was very particular to land life, and 160 metre long, 4 metre wide, inhabited wall. What do you use that building for if it's not for as a visitor centre? So probably, on reflection, maybe some flexibility could have been designed into that building, because actually once the demise of land life, the building became obsolete. But two buildings that are important in the development of this practice. Two buildings, again, that we learned a great deal from, and two buildings that had wonderful clients at their outset.
So I'm keen to talk about your time at the RIBA, and you're described as the architect's architect. And I'm interested in I think when we talked right at the beginning of the podcast, we talked about the triangle of practice and education and the profession. And perhaps, do you think having a civic or political aspect to your career and to the architecture that you've created? You've been members of committees and steering groups for a long time, the Manchester Society of Architects. Has that always been an important part of your development?
It has, but not because I've had any. I've never had any political agenda. It's not something that I. It's just that architecture has always been my passion, and the contribution to architecture for me has been more than designing a building or designing a place, and hence why I get involved in some small way in education to think about bringing on the next generation of architects, but also to contribute to the profession, whether it be the client program that you mentioned at the RIBA, or optimizing on the drawings collection, which I tried to do when I was at the RIBA, the education review we touched upon. I just felt that I've always had a responsibility to influence in all aspects, and not just simply in terms of design. I became a nationally elected member to council because I wanted to contribute. And as you quite rightly said, Paul, I sat on the education committee. Felt that I've never seen myself as being a backbencher. If I'm going to get involved, I sort of commit myself wholly to something, and so I was never going to be content with just sitting on the back bench, making the odd contribution in council. I've also been very passionate. I also like to think I'm a passionate regionalist, and so when I became vice president, it was because I wanted the regions and the nations, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, to have a voice, and that was something I was very pleased to do. The structure in the practice allowed me to do that. And as I said earlier, certainly other people and Claire came to the fore to allow me to do it. I think it improved me as an individual. I think the experience of being president. I'd like to think I tried to make the RIBA more outward facing whilst I was there. Hence the architecture gallery,
of course,
the client program, but equally you engage with issues that were probably inconceivable when you close that presidential door.
Of course,
you're engaging with things with aspects that I'd never engaged with before, and so it was quite an enriching experience. And again, in pursuit of this holistic approach to architecture, it was something that I think, speaking personally, benefited me hugely. As indeed my role at the Construction Industry Council.
Exactly, yeah.
With 35 member institutions, it's brought me. I'm engaging with other built environment institutions in a way that I've never done before.
Has that given you a broader perspective on the industry comparative to what you had previously in your career? Just as your time,
and things like climate change.
Of course,
when we've emerged from this emergency, there's an even bigger emergency out there, which is climate change. And as Sterling Prize winning practice, we signed up to Architects Declare very early on. It's so important that if you're going to address or redress the issues of climate change within the industry, you have to collaborate, you have to come together to do it. And whilst all the institutes have their own policy on climate change, the issue is too big, and it needs all the institutions to come together. And so the Construction Industry Council, and as chair, I've been able to. Even CIC is in a unique position to be able to do that, and so I've been promoting the collaboration between all the built environment professions to come together with one common action plan, with one common statement. It's taken something like the CIC to glue everybody together on what is a mammoth problem.
Because that is really interesting, and one question that arises from both your time at the RIBA and the CIC is the role of the professions, and that every few years, whether it's Latham or Egan or Farmer, there's reports that are about productivity and collaboration, and that fewer silos are required, but in the industry for us to coexist. But yet, I suppose the institutes are also there to defend the roles of those individual disciplines as well. So I'm interested in your perspective on that from being at the CIC in particular.
Well, inevitably, the institutions are there to support their respective members, and conversely, for members to support their institutes. But as I said, there are equally some aspects that it's just simply not possible to deliver. So when I got involved with the CIC, they spearhead largely by Graham Watts, who's the chief executive. They were doing a huge amount of work post the Grenfell tragedy. And they set about 10 working groups to look at what was necessary to bring about systemic change within the industry to make sure that something like that never happened again. And so there was a perfect example of how not one institute could deliver on that. And I think the other aspect of it as well is that, you can imagine government with all this myriad of institutions within the industry. They want one voice. They want to be able to speak to one coordinator, and so that was most of that work was largely coming to a conclusion, which resulted in the Raising the Bar document. I was very much at the tail end of that, so I didn't really contribute to it. But it became a real model for when I wanted to raise the issue of climate change. I held a CIC has a board, but it also has a council where all the sort of constituent members come together. So in November 2019, I held a council meeting where I invited each of the institutes to give a 5-minute presentation on their approach to climate change. Inevitably, some institutions' thinking was far more advanced than others. Those that were a little bit behind, I think they found it incredible. There was a huge amount of knowledge transfer.
Of course, yeah.
And when I think back, we were able to get 28 member institutions to work together to publish a common statement on climate change. The institutes are talking to one another, sharing the responsibility, bringing about change within the professions, and together with the Construction Leadership Council, hopefully bringing necessary change within the industry. And so it's
really good.
An example of how CIC is able to glue the institutions together and get them collaborating, which, as I said, earlier in our conversation, has been at the heart of the way in which we as a practice go about our work.
Absolutely. It's really good to hear that knowledge sharing and that value is being transferred. Our final question is always similar, which is to ask about your hopes for the future. Despite an extraordinary portfolio of work, you've clearly got, in architectural terms, decades ahead of you, the design. What are your personal hopes for the future?
Well, my appetite is insatiable, and my ambition even more so. As a practice, we established a practice in 1983, it always excites me and pleases me that they see constant development, and young architects join the practice and add something to it, and we constantly develop and constantly acquire knowledge. And I think increasingly as a practice, we've been doing a huge amount of build-to-rent projects. We're working nationally. I want to see more diversification in the practice. If you look at the portfolio of our work, I think because of the year that we've been working through, necessarily we've just been building on that particular experience in housing. But I'm conscious of the experience that we have, and I want to see greater diversification. Sometimes people approach me and talk to me about succession. I don't see me ever. We have there's some really wonderful young architects here who, I want to see develop, and we'll see what happens in the future. But I still envisage me sitting at the end of our rather long office with my pencil. Within the industry, seeking an approach to net zero design has got to be something that we absolutely must focus on, and that extends to education in schools of architecture. As I said earlier, that's going to be climate literacy is going to be very much a part of the validation, but understanding that young architects coming into the profession, into the industry, that has got to be a pivotal component of design in the future. We talked about diversification and inclusion, improving accessibility to the profession. Has to be the case. Has to be something which is, when you look at the statistics, they're quite worrying, really, and so that's something that has to change. Where there's huge amounts of knowledge out there that we're just not accessing, and
precisely.
I suppose looking towards more and more efficiencies within the industry, modern methods of construction, modularization. We've seen, certainly in the last 5 years, a development of that approach within the practice. So I see the industry most definitely moving increasingly more and more and more in that direction, which makes the industry more inclusive, makes it less wasteful, and hopefully starts to deliver on that sort of environmental change that we need to see. So we're a part of an ever-evolving profession and industry, which I see no abatement at all, and indeed probably out of necessity I see a great deal of acceleration. And I think that as we emerge from this current emergency, I think that's going to. I think we're going to see that. The thing that really energizes me is the fact that, having been in practice since the early 1980s, that we still go through that progression, and it really energizes me and excites me.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Stephen.
That was a pleasure, Paul.
Thanks so much to Stephen for his time and for his willingness to have such an in-depth conversation into his work and perspectives on the industry. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll take the opportunity to explore some of the practice's work in Manchester, Salford, Oxford and beyond as things begin to reopen. Please subscribe to the podcast on your chosen listening platform and press like or leave a review if you can, helping more people to discover these episodes. If you have any feedback or suggestions, or you think that you have a unique perspective on digital construction and that we could have an interesting conversation, please contact us at podcast@thembs.com. Until our next episode, thanks and goodbye.